Hello, everyone. Good Thursday evening, and thank you very much for joining part 2 of the Brankas Masterclass. Very excited to present our speaker, and I think it'll be really beneficial to everyone. Before we begin, just a couple things. So one is just a word about Brankas, right? So Brankas is a Southeast Asia company based in Indonesia, Philippines, Vietnam, Thailand, Singapore. And what we try to do is catalyze and create and support what is the very early days of open banking and open APIs in Southeast Asia. And what that really means is the API technology and the API products and use cases to support new fintech products, basically, right? And fintech innovation, which means banks cooperating with startups and other technology companies to build new products. So Brankas really does two things. On the one side, we work with bank partners, well, financial institutions, but typically banks, to help them build and manage their open API infrastructure. And we can do that pretty effectively and pretty quick and in a standardized way based on the open banking use cases and technologies from Europe, and in a very quick way. In other words, not a $10 million IBM 2-year project, right? The other side of our business is working with technology companies, fintechs and other technology companies that are consuming bank APIs for integration with their product, right? And that could be for integrating direct bank payments, that could be for account data, that could be for corporate disbursements, that could be for authentication. There's a number of different use cases where a fintech partner would benefit from having a direct API connection to a financial services partner. So that's what Brankas does. It's very early for open banking and open API technology generally in Southeast Asia. But it's a really exciting time because the COVID situation has certainly brought more of a spotlight onto the need for digital financial services, particularly in countries like, Philippines and Vietnam, for example, that are relatively early still on their online economy kind of journey, right? So anyway, that's enough about Brankas. I'm very excited to introduce Mike, our Chief Product Officer, Mike Dickinson. He'll be walking through his view on API product management and some lessons learned from his experience and at Brankas. Just a quick bio on him. So Mike was grew up in Jakarta and has been in Southeast Asia for a large part of his life. He was VP product at Ematic, which applies machine learning to marketing communication tools. He, prior to Brankas, was Chief Product Officer at Zendit, which is a payment gateway based out of Indonesia, where Mike was really leading a lot of their API product development and building out their API and developer ecosystem. But he's also just generally very involved in the product community in Southeast Asia. I think he's a well-known person in the product community in Southeast Asia. He was an instructor for General Assembly on product in Singapore, and he's been actually in product for 12 years now. And he's also sits as a board member kind of as a product expert on companies like Gomodo, which is a company changing how tours operate in Indonesia, which is particularly interesting these days, thinking about what the future of tour operators and tourism generally will look like. So veteran in product, lots of experience on kind of all types of consumer and business facing products, and most recently, real in-depth experience on what it means to build a world-class set of API-based products. And that's really the focus of today's session. Before I turn over to Mike though, please ask questions. This is meant to be interactive. We want questions. It'll make it much more interesting. Mike doesn't want to be talking nonstop for the next hour and a half, so please ask questions. I will be monitoring the Q&A button, so please just at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a Q&A button if you're not aware. Type in your question there. I will see the questions and then I will throw those at Mike when it's appropriate to do so. So please get involved and jump in with your questions as we proceed. without further ado, Mike, it is your show. Take it away, man.
Yeah, thanks, Todd. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join. I'm just going to share my screen here. All right. So can I just get a check on being able to see the screen?
Yeah, you're good.
Cool. Yeah. So today I'm going to be talking about building API products that your customers can love. The way that I'm going to do this is go through the in relation to the product development lifecycle. I'm just wary that there are product people on the call, as well as also people which are from other streams, owners of businesses, engineers, and also from other streams which may not be as familiar with product as well. So I'm trying to intertwine the building and the adoption of API products in the general product lifecycle. And then what we'll do is we'll also talk a little bit about the other component about product, which I feel that in Southeast Asia needs improvement, and that goes even for us, which is around onboarding, right? Onboarding is a huge component of how products or how API products are, how they work. So I'm just going to do here. So Todd has already given me a bit of a background, so I'll skip that screen. So I'm going to start with, I guess, the very basics, right? So what are API products and the difference between API products and API use cases, right? So for those that are not aware already, it's sort of the new kid in town. Well, not even new anymore, but an API is an interface that allows two systems to interact with each other securely. API products are a group or a package of APIs that bring value to the customer. And I'll give you an example of what that might look like in a second. And finally, API use cases are a way that APIs and API products can be used together to deliver value to the customer. So we'll start with API, the API component itself. I'm going to use our own products as an example here. So we have 3 products at Brankas. Sorry, this is a bit of a shameless plug, but I care about our products. But I'm going to use the direct product as an example in relation to API products and API use cases, right? So at Brankas, we work with banks and we integrate to bank APIs in order to, in this particular scenario, solicit, for example, a funds transfer from bank A to bank B. Now, when we're talking about an API, what we're referring to there is there is a mechanism to solicit that transfer with the bank, right? However, that is, in order to perform what would be this direct product, empower your users to transfer funds via direct debit, requires the packaging of APIs together, which forms what we refer to as this API product, right? What this this includes things like authentication layers, or authenticating the user, pulling transaction data from their account to show how much money they have in their bank account in order to do a funds transfer, and to do the funds transfer itself, right? Now, with this, so this is an example of packaging APIs together to deliver a value to the customer, right? Now, the use case, or an API use case, which you often see on API documentation, is actually an amalgamation of APIs and API products, right? Which fit a particular use case. And a good example of that, right, is, say, for example, you wanted to be able to do a top up on a e-wallet, right? You could utilize our direct product, but say, for example, you would also want to pull transactional information from the end user's bank account, so you could show it within the e-wallet itself. we could package it together with this the statement product that we have here, right? And that would help promote a full flow of a top up, right, on an e-wallet, right, and present a use case. And there are multiple use cases, right? So another use case, for example, is reconciliation, right? We'll go into some of this in a bit more detail in a bit here. So really what we're going to be focusing on today is not so much the API components, though we will talk a little bit to it. We're focusing more on API products because we're talking about API product management, and the use cases in how it's important given how many APIs or companies which are using API products today, so that it may, I hope, maybe it will solicit some ideas for you as well in your businesses. Okay, so just talking quickly about the high-level product development lifecycle. Really, it's split into these steps here. So first step is identify. So what we do in product, right, is we try and understand the problems, the hypotheses, and the personas, right, which are involved with whatever problem that you're trying to solve. One thing that I say quite often is that ideas are cheap, right? Ideas are cheap, and a lot of the time what happens in this part of the world, right, is people go straight to solutioning without actually trying to find out what is the problem to begin with, right? So that's identify. Plan is it gets to the stage where, okay, you've identified what the hypotheses are, and you need to figure out, you know, through user research, you need to figure out through interviews, you need to figure out through designs, wireframes, things like that, what it is that you're actually trying to create. Now, in traditional product management, of course, like we talk about wireframes because we're thinking about interfaces, right, in relation to, you know, an application, for example. With an API, there's not really a user interface, but to be honest with you, an API is just another, it's another form of an interface. It's, instead of a human to computer, it's a computer to computer, right? And so there's definitely ways that you can sort of start planning around this and how you can start even testing things without even having to necessarily build things fully fledged, right? Third step is to build. I think this part is obvious. So this is the construction component of the product, and I'll walk through some of the steps that we do at Brankas, and what we do, what I've sort of implemented in other companies as well. Fourth step is iterate. So when you build and you release to market, it's funny because we are currently right on the cusp of deploying a brand new product into private beta as we speak. I think a couple of people on the call know what I'm talking about. We all know very well that once it hits the market is that we're probably getting yelled at more than congratulated, right? And so therefore, the stage of iteration is extremely important. I'll speak a little bit more to how do you collect feedback quickly, and how do you iterate quickly, so that you can you build a better product for your customers. Launch. So after you've gone through your private betas and you've gone through iteration and you got collected feedback, the launch components, of course, is around how do you get the product out into the market. Steady is in relation to it's actually in relation to how do you grow your product, right? If you've already hit product market fit, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And finally, the one which people will maintain, how do you keep the ship running? And then finally, or kill, which is basically if the product fails, which generally people don't want to talk about, but inevitably at some point in your life as a product person, you have to make that hard decision. So we'll start with identify first. So broken down into problem, hypotheses, and persona. identifying the problem, right? So when you're first tackling, you're out in the market, you're starting to hear things, right? You're starting to hear that people need to be able to do something, and they're complaining about something, and you're starting to form patterns, right? So it is really important that you list out the problems which are faced by the market today, and go through, this might sound time consuming, but go through an exercise to organize group problems in order to understand, what are the customer's needs actually are, right? One component which I will say fairly often is that you don't want to build what the customers want. You want to build what they need, right? So understanding the problems from the beginning is a very important step. After you understand what problems are grouped in the, which are faced by the market, it's about how do you order pain, right? So what that means is that you've got certainly some problems which are certainly more painful than others, and identifying what that pain is an exercise unto itself, which will help you in further stages when you are going through things like hypotheses and solutioning. Finally, it's prioritizing pain, right? So obviously trying to tackle the most painful things first, because this will help you develop the MVP, whether you're building a API product, or you're building any sort of product in technology for that matter, right? Prioritizing pain is a very important thing to do. I'm not going to go into too much detail about building a problem canvas, but you can come speak to me. I'm more than happy to chat about it. But basically, building a problem canvas will allow you to understand what is the most painful, how do you prioritize, and in what order are you going to effectively tackle. So after you've sort of prioritized or you understand what are the problems, and you're probably going to come across many when you're building your products, right? And you're wanting, whether you've already got a product live or you're going after a new product, it's best to remember what your customer pain points are, but you will come very quickly to a conclusion of what are the top 3 problems that you're facing today, or your customers are facing today, right? Then what I would recommend is you need a hypothesis. A hypothesis is there in order for you to validate on how do you solve that problem, right? So applying a minimum of 2 hypotheses per problem, so that you can use those hypotheses during the next phase, which is planning, and doing the tests on the plan itself, right? And then finally, I want to talk a little bit about personas. So identifying personas for your products is actually a very important step. The reason why is, why do we build product in the first place? I mean, if it's an interface with a mobile phone or a web interface, right? Understanding the psychology behind how your personas operate is very important. The people which are utilizing APIs, right? I mean, it's just as important to understand your personas, and we'll sort of get into a little bit more around why is it so important, especially during the onboarding process, in understanding, the personas that you're dealing with, right? But broadly speaking, when it comes to API products, we're talking about the developer persona, right? The people which are going to be building to the API and utilizing it to perform a function. And the second one is the business persona, right? The business persona. And this refers to people which may or may not have the technical knowledge to understand how, for example, to utilize APIs or even use Postman, or, but do understand the business value of building into a third-party system in order to address a use case. I also want to just touch on very quickly here. So 3 company tiers across business personas and developer personas are the enterprise, broadly are the enterprise, medium, and small/micro businesses. The reason why I bring this up is important in relation to APIs, because identifying these different sizes will actually helps you manufacture your API products in particular ways. And the reasons for this are, for example, with an enterprise level customer, generally speaking, right, they will have more development resources, right, in order to build to the APIs that you may surface, right? And you know, proposing multiple use cases, proposing or even a sandbox of or a menu of different APIs, it is more likely the enterprise is going to be interacting with those APIs in order to, you know, do the different things that they need to do, right? A good example of that is Stripe pretty much puts an API layer on every single function that they have. However, do the small micro businesses necessarily use all of those different functions in order to operate the businesses? Not really. And so therefore, but whereas the enterprise level have it heavily integrated into a lot of their business processes, right? The medium level customer, right? They probably have engineering resources. They're probably a fast growing startup in sort of that hyper growth stage, right? With medium level companies, however, they also want to build fast, right? And so when they see individual APIs and thinking about the use cases which are available, usually they're not really that interested in stitching them together. And so therefore, you know, your business, when you're building products and you package your products, you're generally targeting these companies that want to access a package of APIs through a single endpoint, right? And that's sort of in reference to the direct product that I was referring to before, right? And why would they want to do that? Well, because generally speaking, if you've got an API product which is solving a problem for in our particular case of doing bank transfers, which is quite difficult in Southeast Asia, to be able to do that through a single endpoint means that product teams in these medium-sized organizations can move fast, right? Then you've got APIs in relation to small or micro businesses, right? Generally speaking, is that a lot of these small/micro businesses may or most likely may not have the development resources to build into anything API related. And so this is where you start to see the application level pick up, right? And so applications get built on APIs in order to service these small to micro businesses, right? So generally when we're talking about APIs, when we get to this sort of size, you find that the APIs are actually built into, or you have partnerships, for example, with, for example, e-commerce platforms. If you wanted to surface a payments API via bank transfer or credit card or whatever. All right, moving on to step 2, I'm going to talk about plan. So UX research, design, and testing your hypotheses, right? So as we remember before, we had problems, hypotheses that we had, right? So what we're coming up with here are manufacturing the conceptual solutions and attaching them to the hypotheses and validating them, right? And I put here without build because I think, the reason why we invest time in doing this is because when you actually go off and build and you end up building the incorrect thing because you've just come up with a good idea, unfortunately, that's a very expensive thing to do on multiple levels, right? And so therefore, what you're doing by doing this is mitigating the chances of that wastage happening, right? So UX research, which is a whole body of product and UX, which we won't go into too much detail here, but it is important, right? So because we've identified the personas, we identified the business users and the developer users, which are going to be interacting with at some point with your API. You need to go speak to them, right? Go speak to them, ask questions to help validate your hypotheses, right? And even offer scenarios and use cases to both the developer and the business user to test as to whether the ideas that have, or the problems that they have can be solved through some of the hypotheses that you've been suggesting, right? If you want to know how to ask questions from a UX perspective, there is a lot of content online that you can access. There's different forms of UX research as well for different customer sizes and things like that. There's definitely tools and sites that can be referred to there. Designing. So when you're going through the designing phase, especially when we're talking about APIs, right, is you kind of have to start from, identifying the use cases that there are out there based on customer needs. Now, the really cool thing about APIs in general is that when you surface multiple APIs to your customers can pick and choose, like I was mentioning before, a menu. They can start picking and choosing, ways to utilize them in order to build, the products and services they may have, or to make their business processes more effective, more efficient, right? However, the thing is that, or at least in my experience, and you'll see, again, we'll go through some examples of documentation in a moment, right? But the reality is that a lot of people don't know what they don't know. Right? And so by providing use cases or understanding what use cases you could potentially be solving for based on the rails that you have, right? Certainly helps move along onboarding and the rest of the conversation, right? So some examples in relation to Brankas, right? So I'm going to use our statement product as an example here. So we have a use case of lenders, right? They want to do an analysis on a loan, right? Or a loan application, right? So in this scenario, right, an end user is applying for a loan, and the lender wants to be able to obviously provide the loan because that's how they make money. But however, there's the whole risk component which needs to be taken into account. Does that person have a salary, for example? Do they have other loans? Do they have a bad spending pattern? Blah, 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 right? So basically credit scoring, right? Now, one way that you could do that is, okay, well, we can pull certain transactional information from their bank account, right? So that's an example of where that happens. Another example, which is entirely different, right, is a business's reconciliation process, right? So, for example, a lot of companies out there, they do reconciliation on products like Xero, on products like Xero, on other ERPs, so SAP, for example. And in order to access that data, right, usually it would require logging into the bank account and then pulling this information and uploading it into the system. Now, Xero has a way to, automate the reconciliation against bank accounts, right? But in this sort of scenario, like with this our particular statement product, right? If you wanted to pull, you're still pulling transactional data, right, from a banking source. So there's no difference between from a product perspective necessarily, right? Between using the statement product for the lender or a statement product for the business reconciliation, but the use case is entirely different, right? So trying to understand the different use cases in relation to the same product is important. I put another example there, bank account data aggregation. So we've seen some companies, for example, in Indonesia, where they amalgamate bank account data for for example, identifying whether you're healthy, you're financially healthy or not, or you're able to use the you're good with your money, basically. Right. So just still on the designing. So from these use cases, we know that customers then need, okay, so we need all transaction data. We need a unique identifier. Was it successfully retrieved? Was it retrieved from a retail or corporate bank accounts? And let's say there's a time component of saying up to 6 months in the past, right? Now, the thing is that with each of these use cases, right, is that some of them will go. So for example, for a lender loan analysis, they may go, okay, we just want 3 months worth of data from transactions, right? Or, same goes for bank account data aggregation. Maybe this is even 1 month, right? But business reconciliation could be, 1 month or 6 months. It depends on, sort of the state of that business, like, or what are they pulling transactional data for? Is it for 6 monthly reporting? Is it for annual reporting? Is it for monthly reporting? There's different scenarios, right? And so therefore, when we build the API, we have to build in that we have to design, for that flexibility to understand exactly, sort of like what we're going to be pulling and what then can be surfaced to the customer. Because the reality is that even if we go, okay, cool, we just add, 6 months, or we say we're going to pull 12 months worth of transaction data. The thing is that that starts to hit another metric within an APIs, which is how long does it take to retrieve the data, right? So that starts to hurt another, and we'll get into KPIs in a second. That hurts another component of the of a metric, which is how long does it take to pull data in the scenario statement. Finally, on this, I just wanted to quickly talk about testing the hypotheses. So, so in this situation, like, I'm not saying go off and build the API, right? But like, it's easy enough for you to go to a business, right, and show the data dump, which you could be pulling, right, and just ask the question. Now, this could even be internally within your own companies, but preferably you do this externally, and find out, if you were to pull, certain data via API from a target bank account, for example, right, then does it actually solve the problem for your particular, or for a particular use case, right? And likewise for the developer, it's like, how do they receive, how do they receive, for example, if you're providing a JSON response, right? Like how do they receive the data, and is it structured in such a way which makes sense, right? Because if it's not, I mean, there's some pretty standards, it's pretty standard on how a lot of these are structured these days, but it doesn't hurt to go and, show what is made available so that you are building towards what your customers need. Okay. I'm just going to pause there for 10 seconds. Is there any questions?
No, keep going.
Okay, cool. Okay, next stage I want to talk about here is the build, right? This is from a product manager's perspective. It's not so much the development itself, but like understanding what needs to be built, and how it's defined is certainly important, right? So first and foremost, I want to just break this down generally for the recs, right, or requirements between epics and user stories. So epics are, we talked about the hypotheses before. So when we're building out our epics, those epics can tie to the hypotheses or the solutions in relation to the hypotheses, so that as you're completing epics, right, you're addressing the problem, or you should be addressing the problem based on certain metrics, right? So in this particular case, the epic's title would be, for example, Transaction Retrieval API, and I always advocate you have to try and define a metric for success of that particular epic. If you're not going to do it at the user story level, which is quite time consuming to be honest, but if your epic is going to bring a certain value to your customers, then it is, if you define a metric on every epic that you have, so for example, in this particular, for transaction retrievals, right, a metric of success is that, you have a 99.9% success rate of the retrieval of bank account data, right? That could be a metric, for example. but underneath epics, what we have are user stories, which is really what is the breakdown of what needs to be built, right? So define the data to be retrieved from the end user. It should be from the end user there. Define business logic, right? So how many months are you going to be pulling for as retrieval takes longer? You know, what do you want your users to experience, right? Like all of these user-centric user stories are going to help the development team understand, you know, what it is that you need to build as part of the API, right? And what is going to be then, packaged up and then served to the developers, right? Secondly, so prioritization, MVP. I just want to talk quickly about catch-all and speed, right? So we went through three different use cases before. Three different use cases before. What you're trying to do with your MVP is do a catch-all on all of them. You can't make all three of them happy, but you have to balance that with trying to get something out to market as quickly as possible, right? So when, you know, for example, with the statement product, right? Like, you know, what is the most important for our customers for the initial MVP? It was like, we need to capture any sort of transaction data within whatever given period of time, regardless of the bank. Unfortunately, banks across Southeast Asia do not have a standard, like some banks will do 2 months, some banks will do 3 months, some banks will do 6 months, right? So therefore, in order to provide something to the customer, in order to solicit feedback to go into the iterative stage, right? You need to go for a catch-all. So go, okay, right, let's just start with 1 month. And, you know, the thing that you're going for there is speed to get the initial product into the customer's hands. So that's sort of like talking, so all transaction data, maybe top 2 banks, just target retail accounts for now. 3 months has been, so basically what you're trying to do is get something together which would address most of these use cases, right? So that it could get to a point that customers can start consuming and, well, effectively giving you feedback and telling you where you're wrong. I just want to touch on this really quickly. So, you know, if you're going into a build, if we're talking about a new product, what I usually say is that you want to go for a Kanban method, ship quick, test, and iterate, right? If you're not familiar with Kanban or Scrum methodologies, there's plenty of reading out there on the market. But really, when you're talking about new products and you're trying to get them out into the market as fast as possible, right? And you're not scared to break things, then use Kanban. You will certainly move faster. When you start adopting customers, or if you're doing improvements to an existing product, usually that's when I advocate for Scrum, right? Because in that scenario, Scrum is like if you so it's packaged into 1 week or 2 week sprints, right? You assign points to your user stories, and what's good about Scrum is that you can sort of predict. You can get into a cadence of predicting when you're going to be deploying features in order to improve your customers' experience, right? Another thing that I want to talk here briefly on is, if you're doing Kanban and you're already at the stage of breaking changes and versioning with your APIs, then I highly recommend switching to Scrum fairly quickly. What do I mean by breaking changes? If you're posting updates to the APIs and you already have customers using the APIs, right, it could cause their system to break, and so of course you want to be able to notify them far in advance that you're going to be doing these sorts of things, and also making it backwards compatible through versioning, right? So an example of this is Stripe. So Stripe does this very well. They provide like a version change log. And they also keep people well up to date as to when they're going to be pushing up new updates and upgrades to the APIs that are currently in market today, right? There's also the whole deprecating or sunsetting of certain versions as well, because you can't maintain certain versions forever, right? And so the idea is that you're moving people along this path over time, right? Away from you know, some of the older versions that they were that customers are using. Another example of this is like Mailchimp does this very well as well. So if you'd like to go check out another good example there, Mailchimp is certainly worth checking out. Cool. All right, we're going to talk about the iterative or iterate stage. So is the hypothesis true? Feedback loops and product market fit. So basically, once you have the build and you get, you know, a private group of testers, you get them to start utilizing the APIs that you've built, you're probably going to get feedback fairly quickly about, you know, so when you're building APIs, you have, you know, mandatory fields and you have optional fields, right? You know, you'll start to realize that they're, you know, okay, right. Should every field be mandatory, for example, right? When you're making a request, and you start to find out, you know, like what, are you actually addressing the pain, right? Are you actually addressing the pain? If not, tweak your hypothesis and iterate on the solution. So feedback loops, saying here, bias towards speed. So feedback loops are really important. They're very different depending on the different products that you have out there. So if you've released a new API, right, ideally the team that you've been working with to release this, they should be having a direct communication loop with the developers. In sort of the private testing phase, right? And the reason for that is that you can iterate quickly based on the Kanban model that you've set up, right, for a new product. And so in a scenario, it's really important that both your developers and your product managers, right, are able to interact as closely as possible with the people which are consuming the API, so that you can improve it if need be, right? For existing products, right, it's a little bit different. So PMs being the center point of feedback collection, both external and external. Product, in this scenario, you find that product managers are talking to many members of the business, as well as also with people in, you know, directly with the customers, right? But the feedback is coming from with far more from many locations, right? And so therefore it becomes a little bit more difficult to make sure that you can make everybody happy, but you can use tools. You can use your own API documentation portal to collect feedback, you know, or you can even use Intercom as a way to collect feedback on an API that you might have just released, right? You can even use it as a way to communicate to customers that a new API is available for them to test, right? And then just wanted to talk about product market fit. So, you know, if your private beta testers have been testing it for a while, you know, you'll already start asking the question, do you have product market fit? The response there is, if you're asking yourself whether you have it, sorry, if you're asking yourselves if you have it, then you don't have it. It's a pretty popular saying in the product management community. It's also about trying to build what they need, not what they want, as I was mentioning before. For APIs, it's not as simple as providing an endpoint to retrieve data, or, you know, for example, solicit a funds transfer, or whatever you're trying to do with the API, right? So there's other components here at play with, you know, for example, do your customers even understand the use cases of what API, you know, the APIs that you built and what they can be used for, right? Now, whether your customers are very engineering focused or whether they are business users, right? Do they actually understand what they can even do with this data in, for example, their own company, or, you know, they may want to even build their own products on top of it, right? Do they know how to test? Right, so that's part of onboarding. How, you know, and getting access to credentials so that you can start testing. And finally, do your customers know how to integrate? So when we talk about API products, right? Yes, we've got a product which is packaged a bunch of APIs together in order to serve to customers. But there's a whole component which I consider to be part of the product, right? Whereby you have to understand how to onboard customers. You have to understand, or your customers have to understand how to test and how to even to integrate and deploy to production, right? And going through all those steps is part of the product and needs to be taken into consideration as well. Cool. All right, so let's say you hit product market fit, right? So you go into a bit of a growth phase, right? So this is where your other business needs come in, and also how you go into a continuous improvement cycle, right? So first of all, analyze. So collect metrics based on the epic set. So remember how we were saying before that we needed an epic, which was assigned to for example, this new feature group of features or this new product that you wanted to launch, right? You have a metric which is assigned there. So the moment that you are out in production and customers are using your stuff, you should be collecting data immediately, right? I put an example here because this is what we use at our company, but there is many other tools that you can use as well, right? If you're doing a marketing site, you could be just simply doing Google Analytics, right? You could be using Heap, you could be using Hotjar. There's a lot of ways that you can collect this data. For us in APIs, we find that Grafana is both cheap and very flexible as to tracking what is going on with our end users and how they're interacting with the APIs that we have, right? For Brankas, we care about giving statement as an example here. So, monthly API requests, so both failed and successful. Retrieval, so consists of multiple requests. That should say RPS, not RP. So requests per second, daily spikes and troughs, time to response, and availability. So during growth, one thing that can happen in some companies is that after a product team has built a product, now again, this is not just necessarily related to APIs, is that they may go on to the next shiny thing, or because the product is working and they find a new product that they want to go after, right? One thing that I'll say is that product always needs to be close to their customers. And to give you an example, product managers at our company own their product. They support on pitches along with sales. They create marketing material. They do documentation. They do Postman demonstrations and onboarding. They even do customer support along with sales. So really a bit of everything on top of the product management stuff that you do on a day-to-day basis, right? And the reason why this happens is because, well, frankly, if you understand every component of how your product works, from business's perspective, from a technology standpoint, right, it becomes a lot easier when you're going off and determining your roadmap and understanding what needs to be built for the future. So yeah, just continuous improvement. So this is what I was referring to before. So it ties into the feedback loop itself. It allows you to create more easily internal roadmaps and eventually external roadmaps. So something which I say fairly often is you can tell the maturity of a product company based on whether the roadmap that they have is externalized or not. Just on APIs very quickly, I also want to talk about breadth versus depth, right? Sometimes you'll come across, you'll have a API which is out in the market and you will surface certain, so for example, with statement, you're pulling certain transactional data in order to package and provide to your customers, right? Or to our customers. So there's a conversation going on, for example, is like, do we go for depth, whereby right now we pull, say 3 months worth of bank data, right, from transactional accounts, Should we extend that to 6 months? Should we extend that to 9 months, right? And sacrifice speed. And then there's the other component of breadth, which is like, okay, what other data can we pull from a bank account at the user's consent? What other data can we pull from the bank account, which we can then surface to the customers? This comes up pretty often when you're building APIs. Like which sort of direction do you go in? All I can say is like build what customers need. So what are they asking for? And what is it going to take to not only to bring new customers on board, but how do you ensure that they don't churn, right? Because both metrics are incredibly important to your product team. Building APIs internally first, then externalizing. So this is something that that companies do, right? So what they do, and we're no different. So like you find there's a problem, especially in relation to your own development team, where they need to access to certain data from certain systems. So they build out the API within the organization, so another team can dog food and consume internally first, and then very quickly after the fact, right, you realize that you can then externalize that API so that you can turn it even to a product, or even in some company situations they provide a sort of free service, right? A good example of that is that you've got companies which are providing like a status endpoint, right, to show like the health of the APIs and how they're performing themselves, right? Or the health of the systems in which they've integrated with, right? And so a lot of the time that in those situations that it's built internally and then externalized. Okay, the final step of the product development lifecycle that I want to touch on here is maintenance and sunsetting. So really maintain is really, there's never a scenario where your product can't continue developing, right? However, there may be other priorities within your business where you have to freeze development on a particular product, right? In order to then focus on something new that needs to be done as a matter of urgency, right? So maintaining could be freezing feature sets, bug fixing, light improvements can still continue, or infrastructure maintenance, right? But really, you get to a stage where you have to redirect the people within your team onto other things, and this product may already be in a state which is at growth and can be kept in that state until such time that customer requests pick back up. I don't see this stage happening often, unless, of course, that the company has had to reset direction and things like that. Sunsetting a product. So just a note here, you shouldn't have to go through this stage if you have hypothesized and iterated quickly, but hey, it happens. But if you have to establish end of life, notify current customers of a scuttle date and provide an open channel for feedback. Okay, so I'm just going to pause there for a second, because the next, I would like to talk a little bit around API products.
Yeah. So my question on documentation, right? So I think someone's asking about, well, it's two questions, right? One, how important is documentation in the product development cycle? So as part of the product development kind of process. And the reason for that is I think this person has had experiences where documentation was promised, right? But then when they actually when they sign the contract and start integrating, it turns out that the technology provider just didn't have anything resembling complete documentation. It probably was a big, huge headache. Yeah. So what does that mean for the product team, and when in the life cycle should the kind of documentation be stress tested to make sure it works for customers?
Yeah. That's a really great question. So I'm actually going to address a little bit about that in the coming slides. But to answer that question, really, when it comes to documentation, it should be, when you're building out your APIs, if you have, or you have the presence of a technical writing team, right, they should be part of the build process through Scrum, right? So if you're creating subtasks within a user story, you need to make sure that you're adding, as part of a process at the very least, that documentation, right? Or to build that documentation within, so that's, that can be commenced before committing to a deploy on the product itself. If you do it at deployment and then you create the documentation, you're going to be sitting there twiddling your thumbs, and your customers are not going to understand why, for example, you've pushed out, for example, a new string, or you've pushed out a new feature, whatever it might be, right? So documentation. And I presume this is documentation that we're talking about facing the customers, right? Whereby they need to know how to utilize it. You need to start the process, when basically through an epic, the first set of user stories are going into review, right? That's when you need to commence it. And you need to make sure that the processes that, like the documentation needs to be contained within like a task or whatever within the epic. If I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, let's carry on.
Cool. Okay, I'm going to talk about APIs and onboarding, and why is onboarding so important to API products, and how do they relate to use cases. So we talked about two personas before, the business person's persona in terms of onboarding, and the developer's persona, right? So really, when we look at the user journey of the business persona, they start, access the website, discover the documentation, understand use cases, or hope to understand use cases, send, and when I say send, what I mean is send it to developers, right? And then pretty much end, right? Now, really what this process means is that the understanding of the use cases, right, is a very important component to really what is the marketing of the API products themselves, right? Because if the use cases are not clear, then you're basically, you're unfortunately for a lot of people, products are not, API products are not exactly, visible and super clear as to what they actually are, right? So in other words, you need to address problems within a business or address problems in relation to a customer set. And if you don't make that clear through these use cases, it's very difficult. It's very difficult to capture that audience and get to that stage of send, right? When a developer persona hits, and this was lifted from one of our own what we call pitches inside Brankas. But what does the developer user journey look like? Well, really, it's a little bit more complicated, right? Because the developer not only has to discover the docs, they have to potentially understand the use cases. Maybe that is maybe not as important, but the understanding of how to access your sandbox, how to generate the secrets, right? Their secret keys. How can they easily navigate through the documentation and the API refs, right? All of this, if it's not automated and made simple for your developer end user, frustration will set in very quickly, and you will find that they will leave the they won't even get to the stage of wanting to test your products effectively, right? Your API products. Other components, I mean, I know there's a lot of hand-holding here, but like reality is this is why, as an example, Stripe grew so quickly was because, when they first built the payment the credit card payment endpoint, which developers could integrate through a simple request, right? It was very elegant, and they made the checkout flow extremely efficient, right? And it was just one line of code that you had to drop in and then make a call to their service in order to process a payment, right? And the documentation was clear. So I want to talk a little bit about API docs, API wraps, Postman collections, and accessing Sandbox as part of this onboarding flow, right? So so we'll start with API documentation first. I just want to say that API docs generally are targeted to a broader audience of people who are trying to get access to your API products, right? Now, when I say a broader audience, I mean pretty much anybody, whether they have a technical background or they don't, right? They need to be able to understand very quickly, you know, what it is that you do, what are the products that you have on offer and what they solve for, right? And finally, how do I get set up from how do I get an account set up in order to start effectively testing, or my team can effectively start testing, right? So I've just put in some examples here. So again, Stripe has great documentation if you're not aware already. But really what they start with are the different use cases, right? They start with different use cases which leverage a lot of the products which they have on the left-hand side here. Atlas, I believe, is their product to get small businesses started, right? Checkout is their payments product, but basically like their APIs can be used in so many different scenarios, right? What is really cool about Stripe is what they present the different use cases to try and explain all the different scenarios which they can potentially support. Another good example is, this is Intercom. So Intercom is a customer management platform, but they have a great documentation portal if you haven't had a chance to check it out. Again, what you'll see here, it's very quick and easy to understand what they have on offer. It's very easy to go off and create your developer workspace, even start creating an application based on their platform, right? The whole idea behind, again, this documentation is to get people without a technical background involved. Twilio is a great example as well, of course. So Twilio, as you can see here, they start with their use cases, right? Their SMS use case, their voice use case, their video use case, etc., right? Now, what is underneath this, of course, is multiple API products, or even just APIs, which have been combined together and packaged for you so that you can start testing with these products. And like they make it very simple for you to understand the original use case so that you can jump in and consume the APIs that they have.
Hey, Mike, a question. So
yeah.
What do you think is best practice for handling requirement changes in the middle of the API lifecycle?
What is best practice to handle requirement changes through the API lifecycle?
In the middle of the API cycle.
In terms of when you're building a new one, or is this when? I guess.
I think so. I think well, the way I would interpret it is, as you're building out a new API service and you realize midstream, because requirements change or you get feedback from the business that requirements change, how can you be, what's your recommended way to be, I don't know, agile enough to accommodate that without starting from scratch?
Yeah, I mean, if it's a new, that really is addressed by the sort of iterative approach in the product development lifecycle, right? But really, what it is that, you may already have an idea about what your API does and how it's being formed, right? Now, the thing is that this is why when you're releasing your API product, right, is that you want to make sure that you're testing it with a small user group first, to understand what problems there are that need to be amended. But if there is a component there where you have to amend an API, which would immediately relate to a breaking change to the private beta customers that you're testing against, right? At least you're doing it against a very fair few number of customers that you've already built trust with, right? But if that's what the customers need, right, within the realms of security, of course, if that's what the customers need, then that's what then you do need to manage that through iterative changes. And if it's a new API, using the Kanban model is certainly the way to go there. That's what I would say to that.
Cool, thank you.
All right, so API references. So where API documentation was more for the general user, API refs are designed more for the developer. This is where the developer can go and refer to the APIs which are available and how to integrate to them. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. Again, Stripe does a really great job of their API ref doc. You can see here like the different client libraries that you can utilize based on what languages that you operate on, and they also are they make it very simple to understand how to test against the APIs that they have, right? Again, another example here is this is Pipedrive, if I remember correctly. So Pipedrive does, again, a great job of doing this. Now, I'll talk a little bit about Postman Collection. So this is popping up on some doc portals more and more these days, I would say, whereby the organization gives you a collection through a product called Postman in order to start testing their APIs immediately, right? So Razorpay does exactly this, where you can simply download the collection, which then you can easily get started on testing against the APIs that are provided. And it makes it much simpler for you to access and see them there while keeping their documentation very lean. So this is another thing which is happening more and more in terms of from an onboarding perspective. And finally, getting access to the Sandbox, right? So it's really interesting because different companies do Sandbox in different ways, right? So in order for you to start testing the APIs against test data, right, you need to create a Sandbox. You get access to the client secrets and all that. What's really interesting is that some companies will expose the ability to create a sandbox through the API docs. This is actually an example of where this is happening. So again, with Pipedrive, you're able to go in onto the documentation site itself, and it's actually a form which is embedded directly inside the documentation site in order to create a sandbox environment. But some applications, you have to create an account with the application itself in order to create the sandbox. Look, I guess it's really you do you. The thing is that you do want to make it as quick and effective or efficient as possible to gain access to Sandbox credentials so that your customers can, in an automated fashion, start testing immediately. Cool. And yeah, that comes to the end of sort of the presentation. I've left a bit of time for questions at the end here.
Yeah, there's a few good ones. So one, I'm actually not familiar with. Do you know what Etag is, Mike?
Sorry.
And ETAG.
Yeah, Etag.
So someone has a question about applying Etag over API.
I'm not really that familiar with that, to be completely honest. That's not. Yeah. Sorry, I can get more information about that.
Yeah, or if you can share, if whoever, they were anonymous, so if whoever asked that, if you can share a bit more detail, we can go into that.
Yeah.
And this is a really good question, which I know we've thought a lot about too, which is what is the right, or how should we think about team structure for creating API documentation? Should this be sitting within the development team? Should it be a separate documentation team? Like, how do you think, tell me about that. Tell us about that.
Yeah. I think this question is a really great question. So at Brankas, at least, documentation at the moment sits within the product team, right? And a lot of the feedback that is received is done in conjunction with the development team. And the reason why we do that is because we want to ensure that the development team has space in order to to go off and build things instead of doing documentation all the time, right? Now, I'm not saying that that's the right model, right? I know companies like I believe Braintree, for example, they had their development team which was writing the documentation, but the technical writing and product writing function at Brankas sits within the product team, because it makes it easier when, for example, the product managers are writing up their documentation, right? They can they're not taking time away when they're asking questions. They're not taking time away from the developers. They're going straight to the technical writers and getting that filled out on that side, right? As teams start to grow, you find that you have you'll have a sort of decentralized tech writing team, which is sort of being requested on projects and things like that. But usually what you want to try and do is have them as close to product managers and the product team as you possibly can, because yes, there is the element of, writing up the refs and making sure that they are correct. But there's a whole component of user experience, right? Which, requires a little bit of marketing flair, I might say, right? But also understanding, when you're writing out the use cases, how you tie them to the APIs that you have, right? It may not be necessarily the skill sets that you're looking for if it was a developer that was writing it. May or may not be. I'm not trying to be partial there, but there are people which are doing UX writing and they focus a lot on this type of stuff. And so that's sort of my response to that. To be honest, I think every company does this differently. But this is what we do.
If an organization, Mike, if an organization wants to launch their own API portal, what are the options for selecting the API platform in Indonesia? Also, what time frame from start to launch? So I guess if I interpret that correctly, there's two questions, right? One is, what is the time frame for a company wanting to build out and launch a set of basically build APIs out of their existing software products, and including testing environment, documentation portal, all of that. So if I'm a software company today and I want to start building API products out of it, what would you think the time frame is? And then when he says selecting API platform, I think the question behind that is there off-the-shelf software that can speed up development time for companies that are starting to develop their very first API products?
Yeah, that's two really great questions. So I guess with the first question, I'm going to speak from experience. If you want, for example, at Brankas, we deal with banks that are moving towards this sort of, open API model, right? But of course, that would require them building out an API gateway on their core banking services, yada, 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 right? And, it really, how long is a piece of string? It really depends, to get an API gateway built out and then and set up, through, for example, through ourselves. Our experience is that you can do it up, we could do it for a bank within 8 weeks, so long as the core banking service that we have worked with it before, as well as also we don't have any political barriers to entry, right? But unfortunately, when, you know, especially within Indonesia, where open banking is a very new concept, right? There's whole regulations which are still being developed at the moment. It's what I would recommend is that you start small, right, with the intention to scale, right? So, you know, look at the sort of app, you know, so look at sort of the I mean, it really depends. If you're a smaller company, right, then yeah, sure, you might be able to move faster, but like always start small, you know, again, go back to the problems that you're trying to solve, right? And build like an initial set of, you know, APIs, MVP, in order to get people to start utilizing. I mean, this is exactly what we did at Brankas. We started, you know, with like, we started with 1 or 2 APIs and we sort of grew from there, right? I would not try and overthink it. And if you're a bigger organization, I would still recommend doing the same thing, because then you can get customers to start testing them and giving feedback faster. In terms of like API management platforms, right? I, you know, not really biased, but Apigee is a good one, right? I, you know, could definitely have a look at that.
Okay. There's another question around the Scrum process, right? So I think what they're asking is so with the Scrum process, it allows you to work with uncertainty, but with large and complex projects, number one, there's going to be, it's hard to foresee all of the needs because, again, it's a big, hairy, complex project and there are unknown unknowns, but also, and this is certainly one I can relate to, some stakeholders only see what they want. They only know what they want once they see that it's there, right? So I think this question is about how to apply the Scrum iterative model on larger projects, possibly with not a very tech savvy, you know, client or user that doesn't know exactly what they want. And how do you think about that?
Yeah. I mean, okay, so you can absolutely apply Scrum to larger projects. First and foremost, I want to put that out there. As long as number one, you already know what is effectively the North Star of your project or product, what you're trying to achieve. Number two, you know what your MVP is or what you're trying to deliver, and that's been defined. Number three is that you are on board with the MVP and the Rex, the initial Rex, with the with whoever the target owner of this is, right? And you know, when it comes to Scrum, Scrum, the beauty of Scrum is when you are able to decrease volatility, right? It's about how do you increase velocity and how do you decrease volatility, right? And so therefore, if you know what is the target of your MVP and the, you know, sort of the compartmentalized recs which you're going to be providing on each sprint, right? Then you know what you're going to be delivered. If your volatility is low, you'll be able to more easily deliver, you know, packages of the, or parts of the software within those 2-week periods. And it becomes like sort of cadence. It gets easier to tell, you know, like, okay, within this 2 weeks, this is the part of the product which we're going to build, and we're this far away from MVP, right? Now that's not Gantt charting, right? That's not Gantt charting. That's just predefining what the MVP is, and using sprints to. The problem with this though is that you have to be very confident in your points estimation, because if you're not, then yeah, you're basically just making stuff up when you're trying to build something else, right? So having like a clear idea and a clear recs about what your minimum viable is going to look like, you can absolutely apply the Scrum methodology. The other good thing about, you know, Scrum is that, you know, you also need to make sure that whoever the stakeholder is needs to be flexible on certain features when you're building them out, right? Because you may come across more detail later on when you're sort of doing your grooming sessions around specific features, and having that sort of, you know, that feedback loop on a per grooming basis, right? To understand, you know, can you cut back on, you know, how much effort needs to be done for how much effort needs to be done for the for that particular feature set. I don't know if I've answered your question, sorry, but like yeah, TLDR, you can definitely apply it.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll just echo that. I think in general, at least what I've observed with product management with large complex projects or large, complex clients is having a clear focus on the North Star. And that North Star, is also the objective of the product that you're building, but it's also what matters to the customer or what matters to the client, right? Because there could be 100 things you're building, but there are 3 things that are absolute must-have. These ones you have to hit out of the ballpark, or else there's going to be whining and a bunch of back and forth, right? So I think having that very crystal clear idea of what success is so important. We just have a couple minutes left. So Mike, I will throw the last question at you, or maybe second to last question, which is, in general, for the folks on the call who are, who are on kind of software technology companies, if you can summarize, what is different about API product management compared to quote unquote conventional software product management to keep in mind, so that people don't have, wrong assumptions if they join a kind of API forward team?
What is the difference? I mean, I guess it's kind of the reason why I applied the product lifecycle, because really it really isn't actually that different. You're interfacing with systems, right? Rather than, for example, building a mobile application with a user interface, blah, 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 right? You're still solving problems. I guess, the real difference and the real thing that APIs force you to do is understand actually what are the problems and the potential use cases which can be generated, right? And onboarding as another component in relation to APIs, which is hard. It's difficult, to be frank, right? And companies, I find, they forget how important it is to make a very effective and efficient onboarding flow to access the API products that you serve up, right? So I would say that onboarding is definitely more complex, and especially when you compare it to B2C products, right? As in B2C interfaces and things like that. I would also say that like having even just a bit of a technical background will take you a long way in helping, but you don't need to be like a massively technical product manager in order to build out great API products, right? Like learning how to use a Postman collection, how to use Postman it's not rocket science, and you should definitely, if you're interested in doing that, then you should definitely be checking that stuff out and going off and testing some APIs, with some of the examples which I showed you. The other things is that like the really cool thing about building API products or being in API product management and how different it is that it feels like that even though you're building Rails, when you're talking about use cases, it feels like that you can solve for so many use cases, right? Out there, right? When you're building, if you're a product manager working on, say, like an application like Grab or something like that, yeah, okay, sure, you are building, but you're still building within the confines of the application. Whereas with APIs, I mean, the world is your oyster. Like you choose what you want to do with the data and what you want to expose to your customers. And there's a huge amount of flexibility which can happen there. Yeah, it's same but different is probably my response to that.
All right. Thanks, Mike. We're right at 7:30, well, Singapore, Manila time. So thank you very much. I think super, super interesting, quite comprehensive, and hopefully useful to the folks on the call. So thanks, everyone. Have a great, for those of you who have tomorrow off, have a great long weekend. And thank you again, Mike, for the presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much for attending.
Cheers.
Thank you.